Welcome to the Attuned Therapist podcast. My name is Rebecca Tatum, and I am your host. And today is our first episode, which is super exciting. And with today being episode 1, I thought that there might be some value in explaining why this podcast exists. And so with that, I'll take some time to talk with you all about this idea of attunement. And then I'd like to share my journey with you guys. Because it's really the fire behind why I'm doing this. So if you're listening to this, you are most likely a therapist, and I am sure that you are already familiar with this idea of attunement. We typically understand it as attuning, towards a child or even, to any client within the therapeutic setting. But how we're going to use this word is attuning inward to ourselves. And when you look at the definition of attunement, it means to have an understanding or awareness of a need, and then to respond to that need in a way that's congruent, that supports or meets that need. And so there's this understanding and knowledge of, and then response to. So it's a decision, action, behavior. And when that dance of attunement takes place, there's harmony, balance, reciprocity. And with young kids, really most developmental goals of early childhood are fostered through attunement. So an infant or a toddler are able to experience trust, reliability, predictability, security, autonomy, initiative. I can do these things. I have value. I'm okay. All of those positive beliefs. And we as therapists, but first and foremost as humans, absolutely deserve to have those goals felt day to day. And I'm not so sure that our profession, whether it be through education or training or, practicums and internships, I'm not sure that that's ever really emphasized for us, that we can be important and we can have choice and power within ourselves, within our relationships, and within our environments, both personally but very much professionally. I'm not sure that that's really ever encouraged. At least it wasn't in my experience. And so, this idea of being an attuned therapist is practicing the art of having deep understanding and awareness of what our needs are, knowing that those needs are important, knowing that we are deserving, and then having this sense of initiative and autonomy and agency to respond to those needs and to know that it's okay to do that. We as therapists are really good about attuning to someone else and knowing what their needs are and knowing how to respond to them. But for me personally, I was really good at doing that at my own expense. And that comes from my own life experiences. But it was definitely also encouraged for me throughout my career, because when I do that, I'm a good woman and I'm a good employee. Who doesn't want someone who will make sure that the job gets done or will take on the initiative of filling in the blanks when other things aren't getting done from others, So, to give a little bit of background, I spent the first 8 years of my career in community mental health. I then transitioned to a group practice, and I am now a solo practitioner. And a lot of what I'm going to share today is awareness that I have in hindsight. I didn't necessarily know this or have this understanding back then. But my experience in community mental health, I think, is probably fairly similar to most. I don't think it's unique necessarily to the state I'm in, which is Arizona. But within the agency that I was at for those years, there were just a lot of aspects that created this environment where the expectations were entirely too high. Um, it's a very vulnerable population to be working with. There's a high level of need, a lot of clients coming in. And because the expectations are so high, there's also a high turnover rate in staff. And so that very naturally creates a situation where the staff who are there have very, very high caseloads. Um, there's also very, very high standards for paperwork, and there's a lot of paperwork. And so the idea of getting your job duties done within the allotted hours each week often felt unrealistic. And it created an atmosphere of being asked to attend to the needs of the environment rather than your own. A good example of that I'm sure many of you can relate to is seeing clients back to back to back to back, maybe 6, 7, 8 in a day. And if you want to take lunch, take it unpaid, because the hour that you get to have where you don't see clients is for paperwork. When I'm sure if they were to average out the time, it probably was more like a 2-hour, if not longer, process to complete all that paperwork that was required. And so I spent about 5 or 6 years doing direct care within that. And towards the tail end of it, I was naturally quite burnt out. And I had internalized it as, I enjoy what I do. I want to be a therapist, but I'm not so sure I want to do direct care. Perhaps I want to try being like an administrative supervisor. I do enjoy teaching and mentoring, and so maybe that's what I meant to do. But when I look back on those initial years when I was doing direct care, I can see how I was taking these expectations from the environment around me with this emphasis from the system that you should be able to do this. If you can't, perhaps consider your self-care, right? Perhaps consider how you might not be managing yourself, and how that's impacting your ability to do the job. And with that type of languaging, I absolutely was internalizing from a stance of something must be wrong with me, right? I'm working in this environment where the stress level is just so high day to day that it became a baseline. And I started to experience like health concerns, that in hindsight, I'm actually quite certain they were connected to what my body was experiencing, but I was so disconnected from, which was my own life experiences coming into why I would have that coping strategy. But there was also no support within the relationships or environment around me to be curious about how might all of this be too much. Instead, and I think a lot of you can relate to the systems in which we work in, there's this mess over here. There's this aspect of how we are being somewhat abusive and how this system is set up, right? We're not fostering those developmental goals. In fact, we're fostering a certain level of mistrust, unreliability, unpredictability, and insecurity. But despite this mess over here, just go take care of yourself. Maybe consider, nutrition, exercise, journaling, meditation, and all of those things are beautiful things, but they're not going to address the mess over here, right? It's a Band-Aid, if even. But when I look back on that time and I'm curious about, well, why did I not see it that way? What was going on for me that I stayed there that long? And really, I'm able to identify it's my own internal system and negative beliefs at the time that were creating this perspective in me that, well, this is my only option. That sounds dramatic now, but this is my only option, and this is what it means to be a therapist. This is what it means to be a good employee. And so if I'm not able to meet those expectations, then it must somehow be reflective of how, I'm not good enough or something's wrong with me. And there were definitely some beliefs around a lack of agency or autonomy for myself within not only that environment, but just what my choices were as a therapist. And so towards the end of, the 5-6 years of doing direct care, I did go for an administrative supervising position, and I got it. And in some ways, it was a breath of fresh air in that I wasn't seeing clients every hour of every day. But I did keep a small caseload because in Arizona, we have a tier licensure process. And at the time, I had my associate level license. And in order to obtain your independent license, you do gather a certain amount of clinical hours and supervision hours. And so I still wanted that to be a goal I was working towards. So and taking on that administrative supervising position, also maintained a small caseload. But it was still too much. I'm trying to do too much. And I found myself in the years I spent in the supervising position, again, still functioning from those negative beliefs and really taking on entirely too much. As I mentioned earlier, I'm very good at attuning to the needs of others and the environment around me, and meeting those needs even at my own expense, and even when in hindsight those weren't my needs to be meeting. But I do come from a place of seeking perfection and having like a high level of responsibility, and so I'll just put this weight on me. And I think there's potentially a lot of therapists that relate to that, right? And so towards the tail end of being in that administrative position, being in community mental health, I had my first and only child. He was born in September of 2019. And then, as you all know, 2020, the pandemic started. And my son was 6 months old. And I had returned from maternity leave a couple months prior to the pandemic starting. And, in looking back, it's not that the experience of the pandemic caused this shift in me. It was more so, it was like the straw that broke the camel's back. I have this infant, and I was absolutely not prepared for pregnancy and motherhood and what that would be for me. And then there's this pandemic, and then all these stressors that have been my baseline at my work. All of that came together, and it was just too much. Too much. And at that point, I had also grew some resentment about the relationships and environment that I was in, and feeling that I was being taken advantage of. And in hindsight, yeah, I put myself in that position. If I'm the one who's going to show up every day and make sure the job gets done, well, then I'm going to be the one that they rely on to get the job done, regardless of if it's my role or if I'm being compensated for that. And so I left, and I got a different job within community mental health, and that environment was not good. And so I left shortly after. And at that point, I had put in my notice without having another job lined up, and was just in my head like, well, I'll go back to doing clinical work, right? Oh, sure, I'll just put some time in to get my independent license. And in job searching, I found a position in a group practice, and ended up working there for a year and a half. And that group practice was a dual between cash pay clients and commercial insurance. And so it's a different system from that of the agency I was at before. And with that change came a breath of fresh air. The amount of regulation and expectation just substantially decreased. I was in a position where I was just someone's therapist, when comparatively in community mental health, there was this dual role of therapist and case manager for every client that you worked with. And in hindsight, I can see how that just created some real unclear ethical boundaries at times. And so being able to spend time within that group practice allowed me to really be reflective on who I am as a therapist. I'd completed my EMDR training while there, and that was just like mind-opening. I fell in love with EMDR. I still am. And, you know, to kind of paint a picture, within the group practice, they did foster for me those developmental goals. There was trust, there was reliability, there was predictability, security. I was encouraged to have autonomy and agency. You know, I scheduled myself, and I did a lot of marketing for myself, and they were absolutely supportive and helpful in that arena as well. But in many ways, I was like my own little mini business provider under their business umbrella. And I, I just had more space to breathe. I can't even articulate how much of a shift it was for me. But I'm sure you guys, in your own experience, can imagine. But with me being able to set my own schedule and decide when I was going to see clients and when I was not, and how I was going to schedule them and how I was going to structure my day, and then just having a substantial decrease in paperwork expectation, it opened up free time in my personal life. And it allowed for me to be reflective of like, well, what do I need? What do I want? And it's incredible to me looking back how it was, I just needed that space to do it, and that permission to do it, right? That, you know, coming from the owner or my clinical supervisor at that practice, it's like, well, you decide. You know, you decide your schedule. You decide when you want to be here and when you don't. And then also my supervisor additionally gave me the permission to actually work within my scope. Which in hindsight, saying that out loud, it's like, man, I should have been allowed to do that from the very beginning. That's literally within our ethics. But I hadn't been. And I also had not found it within myself to advocate for that. And so when I was given permission to do that, that was also just so freeing, right? That I can have a choice. And so with having all of this come about for me in this new, essentially, sense of self, and then also in providing EMDR, I'm sure for all of you who are trained in it, you know very well that if you are guiding someone through their own EMDR, you are going to recognize what you need EMDR for, and you're not going to be able to ignore it. And so I dived into my own self-exploration and growth in that sense, with this spare time and with really exploring, you know, who I was as a therapist. I returned to reading, which growing up, I was a bookworm. And in my 8 years in community mental health, I maybe read one book. And so that first year in the group practice, I probably read close to 20 different books. And they were all somehow related to like EMDR and advanced concepts within it. And yeah, it just was such a beautiful time for me to be curious about, again, what do I want and what do I need, and what am I going to do about it, right? Because I can. I also just returned to my health in a different way and valuing my own like nutrition and exercise, and not from I'm dysregulated all day, I need to somehow attend to my self-care so I can feel okay. It was more, okay, I am now feeling regulated, and so I can start thinking about how do I value my health and my nutrition, and myself. And keep in mind, this is like 2021, so the pandemic is also still happening. And with all of that, I also recognized that I wanted to be healthy, right? For myself, for my family, for my son, and that I can do that, right? I started running again. I used to run as a teen. I hadn't ran in years. Just a lot of really small pieces came together that was just these foundational blocks of, oh, my needs are important. And they actually might be important first and foremost, right? It's that cliche thing that we tell clients all the time. When flying on an airplane, you got to put the mask on yourself before you put it on someone else, right? And I'm sure some of you as therapists have even been told that from the framework of like what it means to be a therapist. But I mean, the way that I was experiencing this in 2021 was just so radically just deep and body based and centered around understanding myself to the core and really understanding my belief system and my internal system of parts and making sense of my experience into motherhood, which was very jarring. Um, Making sense of who I was all those years in an environment that, looking back on it, was not an environment that was serving my health in any way, or even my professional growth in the way that I experienced it could be. I did have professional growth in that environment. I did have supervisors that supported me. I'm in no way meaning to imply that there was an absence of that, but there were limitations to it based off the system. And I know that to be true now, having the experience that I've had. And so, yeah, 2021 is just new year, new me. And as I go into 2022, I'm approaching obtaining my independent license. I am starting to entertain the idea of like, I can open my own practice. Like, this is totally attainable. And keep in mind, my husband for the past, or the 8 years prior, was like, you should go into private practice. You should go into private practice. And I was like, I can't. With no reason why. It was just, again, I had gotten myself into such a limiting and constricting mindset that it just didn't feel like an option. But I've now been working in a group practice and seeing it to be an option, right? Like, oh, this is totally feasible, and I've been an independent contractor. I've been doing a lot of this on my own. Sure, there were things that my supervisor and the owner were doing that I wasn't, right? It wasn't my business, but it just felt attainable. And around the time period that I really started to entertain that as an idea for myself, I was recommended to listen to a podcast. It's called Zero Disturbance. It's by Cambria Evans. And she has completely changed my life trajectory. And, it was a podcast episode I was recommended to listen to, and she has an abundance of content, podcasts, trainings, consultation programs. And I just became obsessed and digest everything that she has to offer. And through that experience, she gave even additional areas of permission of what we are not only allowed to value for ourselves as therapists, but also as business owners. And I am forever grateful for her and the messaging that she gave me. And in many ways, this podcast is my way of giving back what was given to me. So the universe worked for me in a way that is just so beautiful. So as I'm coming into the 6 months before getting my independent license, which is what I need in Arizona to then open my own practice, I'm taking in all this content from Cambria, including this idea of doing EMDR intensives, which is basically longer sessions and at an increased frequency. Taking in these concepts of like, it's okay to not take insurance, and it's also okay to have intentional generosity and how you might then give back. It's also okay to take insurance. Just know that it's your decision to make, and that if there's any level of like shaming or judging language around it, that doesn't necessarily have to be your internal experience with that decision. Because at the group practice I was in, it there was some cash pay, but most of it was insurance based. And I saw how stressful that was for my clinical supervisor. I mean, there was a 2-month period when I first started working there that I don't think she got a single check from the insurance carrier. And she still paid me. I'm not sure how. But I saw how much it was to manage the insurance piece, and also knew that it was less pay. And that reminded me of community mental health, right? Like, there's this system in place where it's like, do the most just to get by. And I didn't want that for myself. I didn't want to be working 40, 50 hours a week just to get by. And to really not advance myself financially. At this point in 2022, my husband and I had a couple years of just things not going our way, where we had gathered a good penny of debt. And in me opening up my business and planning to be a solo practitioner, I wanted to have a sense of financial security. I didn't want to just be repeating history. And the content that Cambria provides, and then my experience with that group practice, really opened up my eyes to the sense of opportunity and choice that I had as to how I was going to structure my business and opening it. And so going into December 2022, I opened up shop. And I did so as a cash pay practice. I did so under the framework that I was only going to be accepting new clients for EMDR intensives. And mind you, I had some clients who transitioned with me from the group practice to my solo practice. But since December 2022, I've only accepted new clients for EMDR intensives. One, because I stand behind them. They're extremely effective and efficient. But two, it is a high value service. The way that I have that program structured allows for me to charge a higher rate than like comparable in my area. And in me doing that, it allows me to then have so much balance and freedom in my schedule, and both personally and professionally. And so since opening up my practice, I have tripled my income. I have maintained referral security. I have routinely been booked out about a month for EMDR intensives. And I am also in a position to be doing a podcast and to be offering consultation and creating training kits for other therapists. And I'm doing all of this because I know deep to my core that I am deserving of it, and that I'm capable of it, and that I'm enough. And that I can absolutely control what I can. And that I'm going to be okay. You know, coming into opening up this practice, I have not experienced a scarcity mindset of, what if no one calls? What if I don't get any referrals? You know, they ebb and flow, but they'll come. Referrals will come. It's going to be okay. And it hasn't been absent of effort. I've done a buttload of marketing and getting my name out there. But even in doing that, there is a confidence and an initiative that I can and that I will. And I did. And so I think perhaps another piece to share with you all that was pretty cool for me to share is that when I had my son, I felt pretty adamant that I didn't want to go through pregnancy or early motherhood, now that I know what it was for me. But I was pretty sure I didn't want to go through it again. And I was sad about that. You know, I want to have another kid, but I just don't know if I could do it. And sitting here with you all today, I absolutely am going to have another kid. And my ability to decide that and to feel secure in that decision wholeheartedly comes from the attunement that I've been practicing towards myself for the past several years. The needs that went unmet during my pregnancy and early motherhood are now met, and I'm able to see and recognize that that's why I hesitated before in committing to that again, and that that's not going to be my experience this time. It will be different. And so with all that you just heard me share with you, my hope for you is that you yourself are able to develop the practice of attuning inward and having a very, very deep and robust understanding of what your needs and what your wants and what your dreams are. And then having a sense of agency and autonomy in your ability to make decisions and take action to meet those needs. And for that to be a shift not only within yourself, but your relationships and also your environment. And my trajectory doesn't need to be yours. You can absolutely have that experience in any setting or system. But that perhaps might also be the experiment for you in deciding, is this attainable here? Or does it need to look different from an environmental or relational aspect? But those words I mentioned earlier, this idea of trust, predictability, reliability, security, autonomy, let those be your compass. That is what you deserve, and that's what you're striving towards. And then eventually that's what you're maintaining and just experiencing. So I had mentioned this earlier, but again, if as you're listening to this, you have additional thoughts or comments, I'd love to hear from you. You're more than welcome to email me. My email is info, INFO, @attunedcd.com. Thank you guys. Have a good rest of your day.